In this video, I'm going to be discussing a piece by Axel Gelfert called Fake News, There's No App for Truthfulness. So the main issues of this piece is, first of all, to analyze the nature of fake news. What is it? Is it something new? Is it a new category in addition to misinformation, etc.? And then we're going to look at what should we actually do about it. So a little backdrop, a little background to this issue. To quote Gelfert, whatever autonomy we gain as we grow into competent members of societies is acquired against the backdrop of a pervasive epistemic dependence on one another. So as we develop as responsible citizens of this democracy, we get it through learning about things, learning about the world. So we get it against a backdrop of being dependent on one another for knowledge. So epistemic dependence means we depend on one another for knowledge. So where this knowledge comes from, how reliable those sources are, that's very important for developing into autonomous, self-governing individuals. And this is especially acute today because, to quote him again, in an age of information overload, it becomes ever more challenging to tell legitimate information apart from misinformation or fake news. So I think we're all aware of this, how today images can be generated by AI, audio can be generated by AI, so sometimes, or often, maybe increasingly, it can be difficult to tell what is real and what's not real. He begins by looking at what fake news is, but even before that, he looks at whether or not fake news is a new category or if it's just a repackaging or kind of disinformation or misinformation. So is fake news something new? Well, there's always been misinformation out there, even before the printing press. But I remember reading about an account with the advent of the printing press. Somebody distributed these pamphlets widely circulated about how to identify witches, witch practices, these kinds of things during the European witch hunts. And it was all misinformation, nonsense, but people believed it. A lot of people believed it. So you even had, you had conspiracy theories and these types of things for a very long time. So you might say, well, there's nothing new about fake news. So that's what he's going to look at now. So let's look at why this question is important. So to quote Gelfert, he says, if we assimilate everything we see around us to traditional concepts and categories like fake news, like misinformation, we may end up missing out on genuinely new aspects, such as the convergence of social, political, and technological trends in ways that, taken all together, risk undermining the very institutions of knowledge, science, education, public debate, that we will need most if we are to deal with the global existential challenges that lie ahead. So what he's saying here is that if we think fake news is just another kind of misinformation, if it's an old category, we risk missing something unique about fake news that's dangerous. Something unique about fake news that can prevent us from confronting challenges of existential risk. So risk to the survival of humanity, things like that. So that's why it's an important question to ask to see, is fake news something new? He goes on to look at some characteristics of fake news. He's not going to define it quite yet, but just what are some general characteristics of fake news? But before we can even get to that, let's define just some other categories involving news. So news itself is information or reports about recent event, typically published by or broadcast by identifiable sources, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. It's also important to distinguish between news and opinion, or news or reporting in that category versus opinion or commentary or analysis. Let me just give you some examples of this by bringing up some news sources. So here we have a legitimate news source, the Wall Street Journal, and you can just scroll down here, see all the different stories, opinion pieces, et cetera, et cetera. And so any good news organization is going to clearly distinguish between what is mere opinion or analysis or commentary versus what is news or straight reporting. So here we have straight reporting. They're an exclusive to the New York Times, straight reporting right here, or news. And they clearly show, well, what is opinion? What is views or commentary that are expressed by the editorial board or by a number of other writers So here we have the Wall Street Journal. Here's the New York Times. Same kind of thing. We have straight reporting here. Straight reporting. And then there's a whole category of opinion. So a little bit about bias. You'll have bias in both reporting and opinion. With reporting, usually when you have legitimate news sources like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, the reporting of the facts are usually accurate. But where the bias comes in is what is reported, what's weighed in certain ways, and also the framing. So that's usually where the bias comes in with the reporting. And it's obvious where bias can come in with opinion. I mean, those opinion pieces are supporting certain views that can lean one way or the other way. But it is important for news agencies to clearly distinguish what's opinion or commentary or analysis from what is just straight reporting. So again, Gelfert characterizes fake news, but at this point he's going to avoid defining it. So we're just kind of getting a ballpark understanding of what it is. So here's some characteristics of fake news that he looks at. First of all, it's epistemically deficient. Now, epistemically means having to do with knowledge. So if it's epistemically deficient, you should not base your beliefs on it. So that's the one characteristic. Another characteristic is that it reflects certain intentions. It reflects manipulative or deceptive intentions. The point of it is to manipulate or deceive people into something. It also functions to secure its own circulation or uptake. So there's something about fake news that makes it spread faster and easier than straight responsible reporting facts. So for example, fake news can be it's very clickbaity or very clickable. It may elicit strong emotional responses, which makes it spread fast. So that's part of fake news. Another part of fake news is social media. The medium through which it's spread is fairly unique. It usually spreads through social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, X, Facebook, or YouTube, etc. And that plays an important role in its dissemination or its spread. He specifies that each of these characteristics alone is insufficient for something being fake news, but also maybe fake news doesn't necessarily have to have all of these. So something could be fake news but miss maybe this one. So this is sort of a ballpark characteristic of fake news. So we can try to distinguish fake news from misinformation or disinformation. So misinformation is false or biased information. Disinformation is false or biased information with the intention to mislead. So let's look at disinformation versus fake news. So according to Gelfert, fake news may not necessarily involve intentions to mislead. It often does, but not necessarily. So that's one way in which we can distinguish between disinformation and fake news. So fake news can involve bias or false information being spread, but maybe it's not intentionally spread. Maybe it's spread through certain kinds of bias aggregation systems or biased algorithms, like the YouTube algorithm, which may try to make things very clicky. So there's no intention there in the algorithm, but it's still being spread in this way. So that's one way that Gelfert tries to distinguish between disinformation and fake news. So what that means is fake news can be a vehicle of disinformation. So part of the function of fake news. So we can distinguish between rumor and fake news. Fake news, unlike rumor, is not necessarily propagated widely. It could be propagated within certain spheres. So, we talk about echo chambers in information technology, how people seek out information that they already agree with, dismiss information they don't already agree with. Algorithms exacerbate this, selective algorithms. So people get caught up in their own sort of echo chambers. And so fake news may only spread in one echo chamber. You see this with conspiracy theories, for example, like Pizzagate. There's also a fairly new epistemic category called bullshit. So this word obviously is not new, but a philosopher named Harry Frankfurt sort of analyzed bullshit as this new epistemic category, wrote a book on it. And we can distinguish it from fake news. And bullshit is it's also a useful category to examine. So we can distinguish bullshit from straight up lying. The liar cares about the truth and tries to conceal it, while the bullshitter, by contrast, is indifferent to whether what they say is true or false. What they're saying, they don't care about whether it's true or false, but rather instead they're focused on producing some sort of impression. So here's an example. Imagine a spokesperson for a company says something like this: our company is leveraging synergistic paradigms and innovative solutions to maximize shareholder value in rapidly evolving ecosystems. Okay. This counts as bullshit because, number one, the speaker doesn't care about whether the claims are true or false. That's not the point, to assert what's true or what's false. The language is vague, inflated. It's about managing impressions. And the goal of it, again, is not to say something that's true, but rather to sound visionary or competent or convey some kind of information. One of the key features of bullshit is that it's asserted without any care for the truth, but rather aims at persuasion or managing an image or something like that. So again, bullshit is assertions that are indifferent to the truth and try to conceal the fact of that indifference. So what's the difference between bullshit and fake news? Well, a lot of fake news is not merely bullshit, since the propagators of fake news, if there's an intention behind it, do care about what's true insofar as they want to hide it. So fake news can often involve, say, lying rather than bullshitting. Now, that doesn't mean that fake news is never bullshit. It can be bullshit, but it can also involve lying. So that brings us to his definition. So he begins by giving these ballpark characteristics, and now he's going to take a stab at trying to define fake news. So he defines it as the deliberate the deliberate presentation of manipulative and misleading content as news, where the content is manipulative and misleading by design. So there's an intention there behind. Gelfert goes on to ask how political fake news is. So he's looking at the relationship between fake news and politics. And he starts by noting that many have argued pretty convincingly that fake news erodes public trust, increases political polarization, and is bad for democracy. And this is later going to segue into the harms or potential harms of fake news. And so he talks about how political polarization contributes to the spread of fake news in a number of ways. Now, one thing to note here is that if fake news increases polarization and polarization increases fake news, then you have this sort of vicious causal cycle between fake news and polarization, where polarization causes fake news causes polarization, and it just sort of builds from there. But let's look at some of the ways in which political polarization can contribute to the spread of fake news. Well, the first thing to note is that polarization motivates the creation of fake news to discredit political opponents through smearing and things like this. The second point is that fake news can act as fodder for motivated cognition and confirmation bias. In other words, it can act as fodder for this tendency that humans have to basically believe what they want to believe rather than what's accurate, or believing what already confirms the beliefs they already have, rather than being exposed to other information that goes against their beliefs. So fake news kind of plays into this confirmation bias, and our confirmation bias probably helps to spread fake news, because we're more likely to believe something usually if it confirms what we already believe, even if it's not accurate and even if it's fake news. So the third point that he makes is that general news avoidance, which is caused by this political polarization, and so there's less corrective to beliefs acquired from fake news. So because of lots of political polarization, things get toxic. For example, people don't read the news as much, and so when they're confronted with fake news, they're less likely to be corrected if they believe the fake news, because they're avoiding news altogether. Gelfert notes that some have argued that fake news, this term, it's merely a political slur that's used to discredit unfriendly reporting. So note that this is a different definition from Gelfert's definition or understanding of fake news, where this term fake news is just kind of like a weapon to try to discredit news that, say, a politician doesn't like. So the example that he cites is Donald Trump using this term fake news to label any news that maybe makes him look bad or that he doesn't like. So behind this usage, to quote Gelfert, some have argued lies an attempt to delegitimize the institutional press as a whole. So this label, fake news, may become a kind of rhetorical device used by the powerful to crush any kind of dissent. So any kind of dissenting views or criticism of the powerful will just label it as fake news to try to just delegitimize it as a whole. So again, note that this is one understanding of fake news. It's not exactly Gelfert's understanding, but you might even say in certain contexts that this understanding is accurate, but we could use his definition of fake news in other contexts. So at this point, Gelfert has looked at the epistemic problem of fake news. In other words, the issue of how fake news can spread false beliefs, or why you shouldn't base your beliefs off of fake news. But there's also what he now takes up is the moral problem. So the moral problem of fake news examines what is bad about fake news, or what is wrong with spreading fake news. And he divides this up into two approaches, or two moral problems that we can look at regarding fake news. On the one hand, we can look at the collective effect that fake news has on society as a whole, or on a democratic society, the democratic norms of society. And he states, to quote him, that the circulation of fake news, it may have certain bad consequences. Namely, it could lead to bad decision making. It could chip away at the perceived legitimacy of democratic political processes. So, for example, spreading fake news that an election was a sham could undermine the legitimacy of this democratic process, or at least the perceived legitimacy, which could contribute to the erosion of democratic norms in a society. So with this approach in general, we're looking at the overall consequences of fake news. So when we're looking at how we respond to fake news, which he's going to talk more about later, on this consequentialist approach, we're trying to figure out, okay, what should we do about fake news to prevent this overall bad consequences on society, or to produce better consequences overall on society. But a different way of looking at the morality of fake news is on a more individual level. And here we're more focused on the intentions, or the bad intentions of the purveyors of fake news. So on the one hand, the overall consequences of fake news, or the propagation of fake news, matters, but also those who actually are doing the propagating of fake news. How should we sort of judge them or deal with them? And here we're looking at, judgments of character. We're looking at how individuals who promote fake news are breaking certain norms of trust. So this gets into issues about whether they're lying or merely misleading, which are different, what counts as lying, and so on. And he ends this section by noting that we need to look at both, and too much focus on the individual level here, looking at, say, the people who actually purvey it, risk missing the more systemic problems of fake news on society as a whole, and how that might erode certain democratic processes, or avenues of acquiring knowledge about what's going on in society. Okay, so what should we do about fake news? How should we deal with it? We looked at the ways in which it could be bad, both on an individual level and collective level. How should we deal with it? Well, on the individual level, Gelfert points out a few things. And this is at the level of individual behavior, things that we as individuals can do and help other people do. He notes that older generations are more susceptible to believing fake news than younger generations. And part of the reason for this is because they don't have as much information literacy. So education, teaching people to think critically about what news they're getting, the sources, and information literacy can go a long way. So that would be on the part of an education system. And also on the individual level, holding people accountable, either for putting out fake news, maybe calling people out for putting out fake news, and also developing good informational habits, which is part of information literacy. And he's going to talk more about this a little bit later on. So that's how we can deal with fake news on an individual level. But what about a collective level? He talks about the potential for legal regulations. And he gives a couple examples in the book. If you see of some illiberal democracies and an example of liberal democracy implementing this and how it can go wrong, even on both cases. And just to clarify, illiberal democracy just means democratic system, but where people have less rights, whereas liberal democracy just means a democratic system where people do have rights. So the United States would be a liberal democracy in this sense. So some of the advantages of legal regulations would be that maybe it would weed out some or a lot of fake news, but it does come with some costs or cons. So one con is that there's more potential for abuse by governments, particularly illiberal governments or authoritarian governments, where they can just sort of label something as false news in order to really just censor news that goes against what they're doing or that's critical of the regime, for example. So there is potential for abuse by governments with these top-down regulations. And also, relatedly, it is difficult to define fake news for legal purposes. And so that can, again, leave open potentials for abuse or just not really being very effective in accomplishing what we want, which is kind of getting rid of it. So broadly speaking, one of the difficulties with legal regulations is the potential to go against freedom of expression. It kind of pushes up against freedom of expression in many cases. Another example is to implement technological tweaks in order to weed out fake news. So, for example, some people have suggested sort of algorithmic approaches where there's automatic fact checking. So there's a lot of pros to this where you can identify news that is just inaccurate and not correct, and that's good. But one disadvantage here is that it does have limitations. So it doesn't do a good job at checking for the context, what's left out, how things are framed. So it may be helpful, but it may not do enough. So this brings us to the end of Gelfert's essay, where he discusses some recommendations with how to deal with fake news. And this is on an individual level. He recommends cultivating a good, what he calls informational routine. So just to quote him, he says, routines reduce complexity and can deliberately be chosen and revised. So if we choose a routine well, they reduce the cognitive burden, the mental burden of having to figure out, whether a claim is trustworthy or not. So these routines can include cultivating an awareness of when and how to consult sources and in what frame of mind. So he gives some examples of cultivating or developing a good informational routine. So one is to avoid the comments section if it biases your interpretation. So sometimes you read a story and then you read the comments, and then reading the comments can influence the way you're perceiving the story, the news story. Maybe reduce news intake when you're stressed out. If you're stressed out, you may be more gullible, if you're worked up or in a bad mood or something like that. But also seeking out individuals outside your social media bubble to sort of retrain the algorithm, right? So in scrolling devices, Google, Facebook, where you scroll and find news, the algorithm selects stories for you, and usually the way it works is it feeds into your confirmation bias. So if you sort of deliberately seek out individuals or news sources that may go against your views, you can retrain that algorithm to open up a more variety of news stories that are going into your feed.